Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Different presidential administrations approach the press in different ways. Karine Jean-Pierre spoke about the relationship between government and media in May 2022. Her words came during her first briefing as White House press secretary.
The press plays a vital role in our democracy, and we need a strong and independent press now more than ever. We might not see eye to eye here in this room all the time, which is okay. That give and take is so incredibly healthy, and it's a part of our democracy.
A lot has changed since then, but the importance of the relationship between journalists and the White House press secretary has not. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we talk to a journalist and a member of the Biden administration to understand both sides of the press briefing podium. Later, we hear from former White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. She'll talk about the challenges she faced as a barrier-breaking press secretary. But up first, Matthew Vann. He's senior writer at CNN and adjunct professor of journalism ethics and First Amendment law at NYU's Washington, D.C. campus. Matthew, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Kalila, it's great to be with you today.
You know, we on this show have covered journalists, journalism in all different dimensions. And I'm always curious about people's path into that field. Share with our listeners a little bit about you and how you made the path into journalism.
So for me, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, reading old New York Times papers on the subways, running into the New York Daily News and the New York Post and all of those tabloid papers and the big headlines of the day. That really piqued my interest as a city kid. And when the subway back then was quite different, that was the only reading material that I actually had going into Manhattan on field trips with my classmates or just trips with my mom. And so I grew up reading papers, and I also had the opportunity to go to school with her. She was a New York City public school teacher, and I got to watch her teach current events by having the kids bring old newspaper clippings to class. And boy, some of the things that they would talk about, from the Amadou Diallo case to Elian Gonzalez, the custody battle. I'm dating myself here, I know. But those were all the stories that were markers of my childhood and my formative years growing up in New York City. And I not only wanted to read these stories, Kalila, I wanted to tell them. I would run into local TV news reporters in my neighborhood of East Flatbush, Brooklyn, doing live shots, and I would just, stand in amazement just watching them, and with some bewilderment wonder, like, why is that sidelight all the way high up in the sky? Like, what the heck were they doing? And so it was just fascinating to me. I wanted to not only read the stories, I wanted to tell those stories. And so I went to the City University of New York at Brooklyn College, studied journalism, worked on the campus paper, and didn't look back from there, Kalila.
You are now a senior writer at CNN. And I think, Matthew, many people may have the same question of, well, what does that entail? Given this love of telling those stories, what does it mean for Matthew Vann to be senior writer at CNN?
For me, it's about shaping the public's understanding of very complex and, more times than not, very nuanced narratives. So for me, that entails a bit of research, writing, producing, coaching others to explain some of these very detailed and complex stories in ways that people can understand. I've spent most of my career in network television news producing, and it's very easy here in DC to get caught up in the beltway, thinking about the policy details and all that stuff. But for me, I often go back and think about, how my old neighbors on the block in East Flatbush would think about the stories that I'm telling and understand why they matter. What value can they take away from the story that I'm writing about or coaching others to write about? And when I'm thinking about it from that perspective, it just makes a difficult story become exceptionally clear, cutting to the chase really quickly and giving folks something that they can use to really make informed decisions about the world in which they live.
That attention to complexity and nuance and texture feels lacking in our everyday conversations where people want the highlight, they want the soundbite, and they go on to the next thing. How do you, as a writer, stay grounded in that purpose of, I want this to be a story that my neighbors in Brooklyn can relate to, as well as my neighbors in DC? What's the core grounding for you?
Well, it's really about establishing that context, right? Because I think with what we're seeing today from a lot of the news organizations that are reporting the headlines that we're reading, and even some of the independent journalists that are out there on Substack, they're reporting these headlines, but it's lacking the context, right? So let's look at any one of the issues that are out there, from the president's position on tariffs to the president's handling of foreign conflicts. You look at the first presidential administration, the tariff policy from the Trump administration is nothing new, right? But what's happening right now is that it's being pursued with a lot more clarity, discipline, and aggression than we saw in the first administration. So being able to make that connective tissue between what we saw in that first Trump administration, those first Trump years, to now, those are important details that me, as someone who works in the media every day, I really have to make a conscious effort to bring forward to the viewers, to get them to think back and say, hey, remember when this was happening? Well, this is why it's happening now, but with this sort of assertion or aggression that we're seeing today.
I think the ability to put things into perspective is also why it's so important to have diverse voices in newsrooms, to think about not just that lived experience, but that attention to detail that you can bring. You wrote a piece earlier this year that talked about the ways that journalists were covering the retreat from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I think it was so important that you were the person writing that story because, yes, you brought a journalistic piece. It was a beautiful piece, and also one that, Matthew, if I'm candid with you, I read it and I was a little angry because I read it and said, yes, absolutely. And why do we have to keep reminding people? But your piece said, yes, we have to remind people. Share with our listeners a little bit about that piece.
Sure. So the main point I was trying to get across in that piece was really that news outlets were covering all these DEI rollbacks as though 2020 never happened, right? And that is, in my opinion, a serious journalistic dereliction of duty. Because if we're just covering all of these rollbacks at these Fortune 500 companies, getting rid of their diversity teams and scrapping those diversity statements from their websites, and we're not explaining how they came to be, then folks who are not who don't identify with those racial groups are going to say, "Why? Of course! Like, please move forward." So, as journalists, it's our responsibility to remind readers, viewers, listeners, how these big changes came to be, and not present some of these headlines as though they're whiplash, right? Because that's been happening as well. And so the crux of that piece was really to get my colleagues in the media, those who are in the position to teach like I am, to get students to think about ways in which they can find those connective tissues and also do what journalists are supposed to do, which is to be the watchdogs of society, and also push the ball forward by reminding folks about what happened. How did we get to this point? And it really started with what happened in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter protesters really demanding action and accountability from these Fortune 500 companies to get with the program. And they did. But now we're seeing this retrograde of sorts happening across the business landscape.
That reminder that progress in the U.S. comes in fits and starts can be applied to so many fields. You know, I am an educator, a college professor who gets to be in this journalist space, and it's such a privilege. And I also feel, Matthew, that it is a very difficult time for journalists to be journalists, to bring that sense of integrity, that commitment to the work that is not at the whim of, the public's demand, but really vested in that core. And one of the ways that we've seen that recently is that journalists who were working in the Pentagon vacated their offices in response to new rules put in place by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. One of those rules included not allowing journalists to solicit classified information. What are you and your colleagues talking about this moment or moments in being a journalist in very challenging times?
Yeah, again, Kalila, I think this is one of those examples of where we see the Trump administration doing something that it tried to do in the first administration. Back then, it was unsuccessful when they tried to remove a certain correspondent from the White House press corps and covering the White House. But now what we're seeing happen at the Pentagon, well, that's completely unprecedented. I've had the opportunity to fill in for a few colleagues working at the Pentagon, and I can tell you that those face-to-face interactions with senior military officials, that makes all the difference in terms of the kinds of stories that you're able to tell. So, I'm confident that those stories will continue, but what we're going to see happen, unfortunately, is a difference in terms of the kinds of stories that are coming out of the Pentagon and also how they're told, right? Because that face-to-face interaction is so very important. But in terms of your question about how DC journalists feel right now, I think that there's a realization that the work that we're doing has never been so important as it is now, but we're also doing that with a fair degree of caution. There's more due diligence happening now than there was before in terms of the fact checking, the accuracy, and the sourcing. No reporter wants to hear that their story was or is the subject of a defamation lawsuit or a libel case. So I think everybody is doing their best to cross the T's and dot the I's. And this administration has indicated that it's going to be particularly litigious in taking some of these news organizations to court. So there is that level of concern, but from what I see, there is also this passion to get these stories done and get them in front of the American people in a way that they can take them, give it their own fair shake, and make those informed decisions that they need.
Coming up, more from Matthew Vann. We'll talk about how people can make smart choices in their news consumption.
Lean into your own ability to be a critical thinker, right? And to have your own arguments challenged.
And Karine Jean-Pierre discusses the challenges she faced as White House press secretary.
It became very isolating because I limited and I really closed off the people who were around me.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the relationship between the press and presidential administrations. I've been speaking with CNN senior writer Matthew Vann about how the DC press is covering the current presidential administration. I teach a course called Introduction to American Politics, and I am constantly rethinking, rewriting, and updating the material that I teach. I can't, for example, teach the Pentagon Papers the same way that I used to. Matthew is an adjunct professor of journalism ethics and First Amendment law. I asked him if he's made changes to the way that he teaches his students.
Yeah, I've had to make some changes. I mean, I think the goal of the educator is to make every experience and encounter with the students as dynamic as he can, such that folks that potentially end up not majoring in journalism one day can relate to it, or folks that end up not pursuing and practicing journalism can relate to this. So I've had to encourage my students to step out of their comfort zones a little bit and not only think about ethics in the way that a journalist would think about it, but how would you think about ethics from a business perspective? Where the goal is to maximize return to the shareholder. How would you think about ethics from the point or the perspective of a healthcare professional, where the goal ostensibly is to do no harm and to care for the patient? So what I've noticed is that when I take some case of a current event, whether that's something that happened in the 1970s with the Pentagon Papers, as you mentioned, to something that happened earlier this year with the Charlie Kirk assassination. What I'm starting to see when I push the students a little bit more is this sense of, wow, I never thought of it this way. I never thought of the news cycle as, potentially being a business. I've only seen the news cycle from the perspective of, I've got to get the story done. I've got to file and make this deadline. So I think it's really about giving folks that are learning this craft just this holistic arc of how to approach news gathering and how to approach presenting information to the public. And you only get that when you can see the world through other people's point of view.
You're doing this work with students, with future journalists, people who are journalists right now. I'm curious, Matthew, what you would say to us as consumers of news, as we are making choices, as we are in an era when anyone with a smartphone and an internet connection can put something out and present it as if it is news without all the verification that you mentioned, the fact checking. What do you say to consumers about how we can make smart choices and still be a part of this process?
I think there's value in knowing when you're in the echo chamber, right? Like, I grew up in a home, like this Caribbean American household, where like all of my family members were seeing the world from, that Caribbean perspective. Oh, you got to do it this way, right? Like, this is the way you do things. You go to school, you work in a STEM degree path. You either become a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. I chose none of that. But there's this value in being able to see things from other people's point of view. So if you find yourself always reading a certain outlet or consuming news, or you're listening to, one or two influencers, I think there's no harm in trying to see how the other side thinks and, turn that up for a little bit and lean into your own ability to be a critical thinker, right? And to have your own arguments challenged, right? That's what makes journalism in this country so great. The fact that we can engage with other points of views and other ideas and bring them all together in a way that allows people to make smart decisions.
There are these vigorous debates happening within newsrooms and within different cohorts of people. And so even if the public perception is that everyone who is in journalism is of a particular political bent, that is actually not the case. How do we lift that up, Matthew, so that as we are breaking through the echo chambers, we are also providing space for journalists to break through their echo chambers and be able to step into the fullness of the profession that they've chosen?
Boy, if I knew the answer to that, I would, I guess be like an entrepreneur or like, someone who's really pushing the ball forward there on that. But what I can say is that if there is a way to really encourage like journalists to not only be this representative of their news organization, but be a representative of their true selves, that could make things a whole lot richer. But there are these constraints, obviously, of working in corporate media that are not forced upon those of my former colleagues who are now working in independent media, working with the Substacks, and having all of those awesome and amazing newsletter subscriptions. So I think that's something that a lot of corporate media organizations are wrestling with themselves, right? How do you maintain the brand of an ABC News or the New York Times while also trying to connect with so many people who are consistently evolving in their news consumption and want to hear from people who are uniquely themselves? I think therein lies the challenge for a lot of news organizations, but I think there's also a lot of opportunity and possibility for people and for those same news organizations to figure this out, because the future of journalism depends on it.
You are in a very important profession, a challenging one, but one that it is clear brings you such a sense of purpose, of possibility, and of hope. And on this show, we like to believe that joy is a tremendous disruption that we need to embrace in our lives. So my last question to you, Matthew Vann, is what is bringing you joy in this moment of your career?
I would say really being focused, staying alert. And again, it's about remembering why I'm doing what I'm doing. And whenever I am connecting the dots and thinking about the folks back home in Brooklyn or some of those other cities that I've had the opportunity to live in, and thinking about how they're relating to the things that we're talking about, that gives me great joy. The fact that I might hear from a source who I hadn't spoken to in years, and they'll send me an email and say, "Hey, I read that story. That is amazing. Keep on doing what you're doing." Folks that might just reach out and they've seen my byline and commenting on an article that I thought, that person forgot about me. Like the fact that we're establishing relationships and audience in a very special way, that gives me the fuel to keep going. And it's joy that I don't think I can get anywhere else.
Well, we are so glad that you shared your joy with us, and we look forward to continuing to read those bylines as we build this democracy together. Matthew Vann is senior writer at CNN and adjunct professor of journalism ethics and First Amendment law at NYU's Washington, D.C. campus. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Kalila.
Now that we've heard from a member of the press, we turn to someone from a presidential administration that the press covers. Karine Jean-Pierre was White House press secretary under President Joe Biden. She broke a number of barriers in that role. Here's more from her first briefing as White House press secretary.
I am obviously acutely aware that my presence at this podium represents a few firsts. I am a Black, gay, immigrant woman, the first of all three of those to hold this position. I would not be here today if it were not for generations of barrier breaking people before me.
Karine Jean-Pierre's new book is Independent, a look inside a broken White House outside the party lines. Before we talked about the book, I wanted to know more about Karine as a person. She grew up in New York City, and I was curious what made her so passionate about public service.
Oh, that's such a great question because the origin stories are so important in looking at someone's trajectory and career. And my origin story was very much coming up in an immigrant household, a working family, low income household, and watching my parents work 6, 7 days a week. My dad was a cab driver. My mom was a home health care aide. And it was, heartbreaking to see how much they had to pour into their work in order so that they can pour into us. And I remember when I went to grad school, I was trying to figure out what is it that I was going to do next. And I really didn't know, but I knew that I wanted to make a difference and to help people. And my parents obviously were a big factor in that. And when I was at Columbia, which is where I went to grad school, I had these two great, amazing mentors. One of them was David Dinkins, who was the first Black mayor of New York City, and he was teaching at Columbia at the time. And another mentor was a Professor Esther Fuchs, and they were both very obviously politically involved. She was a poli sci professor, and obviously he was the former mayor. And they took me under their wings. Like Mayor Dinkins would call me his granddaughter, and we would have these, moments and connections. And when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, he was like, "You should go into politics. Like maybe there's something there for you. If you really want to help people, there's opportunities to do that." That's why I went into politics. And he wanted me to run for office. That's not what I did, obviously. But I went to do local politics, and I learned so much about comms and press and legislation and budget. And from there, doing local politics, I moved to doing national politics. And I ended up working on the 2008 presidential election. In the general election, I worked for then Senator Barack Obama, moved to Chicago, and had that experience in working for who would be the person who would become the first Black president. And so once I did that, I went into the White House for the first time, like living in DC and having that experience. So that was certainly my trajectory. And I tell people, especially young folks who ask me, "How did you get to become White House press secretary? How did you get to work for Barack Obama? How did you get to where you got to?" And I said, "I just followed my passion. Everything that I did in this origin story of me was following my passion. And it wasn't a straight line. It was very much a zigzag. I thought I was going to become a doctor. That's what my parents wanted me to become. And I decided that wasn't it for me. That's why I went to grad school. That's why I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. But it's all about following my passion and my moral compass. And that's what I did.
As a political scientist, I have to tell you, I smiled when I saw that passage in the book talking about Esther Fuchs, because so many of us who were going to grad school at that time would read her work about the importance of having a local impact with a national lens. And on this
Yes.
show, we like to feature disruptors, people who are making a difference, who are navigating change and upheaval, but vested in a passion and a commitment. And that certainly has been you throughout your career. You were the first Black person, the first openly queer person to be White House press secretary. And as amazing as it is to achieve a first, to break a barrier, we also know that that can often be somewhat isolating and also sometimes overwhelming, because so many people project their views and expectations and may not always be fair in those expectations. How did you navigate making your way through
Yeah,
all of those
and
first?
and you're 100% correct. It is isolating being a first, and it is overwhelming, both of them hand in hand. working together in that way. And I did become very isolated as White House press secretary because I tell this story all the time, which is I you become a public figure because people see you all the time on their television or online. And so I never, even in my private life, I was a White House press secretary. I'd never had an opportunity to be a private citizen, if you will, because I had to always be on. It didn't matter if I was at the grocery store or at a coffee shop or just walking, taking a walk or a run on the streets in the park. It was, if somebody recognized me, it was, oh, you're, Joe Biden's press secretary. You're the person on TV, on the news that I see all the time. And so it always became a thing and an understanding that I had to have really, really quickly, which is, oh, I can't be Karine Jean-Pierre right now. I'm not White House press secretary for Karine Jean-Pierre. I'm White House press secretary for the president. And so it became very isolating because I limited and I really closed off the people who were around me. I was very private about my life. I was very much people who I would meet, I wouldn't let them in, even though if they were wonderful, great people, because I wanted to make sure I was protecting my peace and my space. And I wasn't very trusting of a lot of people, not because folks were horrible people, just because I needed to protect myself. And the overwhelming piece of it, I think for anybody who is a first, the experience of being that first is that you are graded and looked at and critiqued, and the analysis of your work is very different than anybody that was there before you, because you are held to a higher standard. And people may not even realize that they're doing it. It just happens in that way. And so I had to turn that off, right? I had to be like, okay, I can't pay attention to any of the criticism. I got to figure out how to do this job my way on behalf of Joe Biden, because I'm speaking for him. That's all that mattered. And so I had to be very structured and accountable to myself. And I had to create also a space where I can have some self-care, even in a small amount of ways.
For someone who is admittedly and understandably guarded for all the reasons that you mentioned, let's talk about this book. Your new book is Independent, a look inside a broken White House outside the party lines. You are very candid in this book to talk about the challenge of being in that position during these critical moments of national upheaval, some of the experiences that you had, yes, as press secretary, but as Karine Jean-Pierre in that position, navigating, I have to be loyal to the position and to my moral compass while still being a human to say what is happening is not right. What made you decide, I want to write this book and tell this story in my own words and not have someone tell the story for you?
I think the moment that we're in, the moment, this unprecedented, disturbing, dangerous moment that we're in. When we left the White House on January 20th of this year, I was walking around minding my business, trying to be a private citizen, and I would meet strangers, folks that I've never met before, who had this heavy heart. And they would say to me, what are we going to do? Or they would ask me, how do we get out of this? Why is there not more being done? Where's the Democratic leadership? What is happening? And some folks came up to me crying. And that kind of started the process of, oh, wait, what can I do? Is there a roadmap for me to lay out that people in this moment can find their voice and continue to be part of the process or start being part of the process? And one of the things that I thought about was how the system was broken. The two-party system that we need to have a democracy. We need it to be functioning. And right now it's not. It is indeed broken. And so that's when I started thinking about what is it that I'm going to say in my voice, because I also had been speaking for someone else or another organization for the past several years. And so I wanted to figure out, how do I say this for me, from my perspective, from my opinion, and from my analysis and thoughts, and using a moment from the White House to do so. And so, pulling back pulling back a little bit and allowing people to see the inside, right? Pulling back the curtains. And so I did that. And being an independent, just really, I had been thinking about that for a while. It had been part of my thought process. In the book, I lay that out. If hopefully people will take an opportunity to read that part of the book, we'll read the whole book, but see that part of the book. And I'll say this too, before I even dig into that. I've always had an independent streak, an independent spirit. I think if you're a first, there's something about you that you just walk through the world differently and you think about things differently, I think. And so that's how I felt. And I've always had, my mom would tell you that I was the type of kid that just always did things on my own and did them differently. And she just tried to encourage that. And so this independent thinking is not, I don't think, if you know me, I don't think it's all that surprising. And what I wanted to do by talking about this with this book and talking about me leaving the party and trying to push this two-party system to do better from the outside is that I wanted to start a conversation. Because I think it's important to start a conversation. Millions of people feel left out of the process. Millions of people didn't vote in 2024 who voted in 2020 for Joe Biden. There's a problem. Millions of young people see themselves as independents. So there's a problem here, right? There's something that we need to address, because if folks don't feel like they're part of this process, then what are Democrats not doing? Right? They have to look under the hood and really think through this.
Coming up, more with former White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. She'll talk about being independent from a political party and how she responds to people who tell her that now is not the time to be independent.
These are the times that you need to think through, how do you move forward? And you need to think through, how do you reimagine the future?
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the White House and its relationship to the press. We've been speaking with former White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre about her new book, Independent, a look inside a broken White House outside the party lines. Later in the interview, you'll hear about Karine's recent appearance in Hartford. She spoke at an event called Hartford Girls Rock. It honored the achievements of 10 high school students. It was presented by the Foundation for Educational Opportunities and the Epsilon Omicron Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. I have been a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha for over 28 years. Before the break, Karine spoke about leaving the Democratic Party. She says that while we need a two-party system, it's quite broken right now. Many people may agree with that sentiment, but they may also argue that what the party needs right now is unity. Ask Karine how she responds to people who say now is not the right time to leave the party.
I would say, then when is the time? When is the right time? There's never going to be the right time. There really isn't. And I actually think this is the right time, because in moments like these are the times that you need to think through, how do you move forward? And you need to think through, how do you reimagine the future? How do you reimagine the party? How do you reimagine the country? And this is a time where you're supposed to push yourself. And I think our jobs at Private Citizen is to push for accountability, right? Is to push to make sure that our voices are being heard. That is our jobs as private citizens. I was a public servant for a long time. And I have the ability of understanding how it works on the inside to bring this to this moment and lay out from my perspective. I think people are always going to say, and you see this in history, it's not the right time. It's not the right time. But then when is it the right time? There's never going to be a right time. And look, it's starting a conversation. It started a conversation, whether, whether whatever people are going to say and how people are going to feel, that's really not too much of my concern. My concern is, can we at least have a conversation and to talk about it? I'm willing to take the hard questions. I'm willing to have the conversation. And I'm saying a lot of things that I'm saying in the book is what people have told me and feel.
And I think that for me as a private citizen is also what is so frustrating. I remember when the title of your book broke over earlier this summer, where people knew like, okay, this book is coming and here's the title of it. Without ever reading beyond the title, not even the blurb, people were saying, oh, this is so bad because she's revealing house secrets or the sort of this inside track. It's going to hurt the party. And I kept saying, would you rather be hurt or would you rather put a party, politicians, again, across the spectrum, across all political parties, put them on notice to say, you cannot continue to take people for granted. And it made me wonder, Karine, was it what you were saying or the title of this, or is it that people were critiquing the person saying it? That if it were someone of a different background, a different identity, it may be more palatable. And it made me also think of the ways that people who are first or people who represent tremendously underrepresented groups are almost expected to just be grateful. You should just be grateful that you had this position. What did you make of that kind of critique? As you said, at least I'm starting the conversation, and you certainly are used to difficult questions.
Look, that's certainly what people were saying when I had the position of White House press secretary. She should just be happy that she has it, and people threw in other opinions and thoughts about that. And look, I think all of those things are true, can be true altogether, right? Whether it's how they don't like the criticism directly of the party, so they have something to say about that, and who is the messenger, what the messenger looks like, they have problems with that. I think all of those things could be true all at once. But, I also think that the reaction didn't match what was in the book. I really, truly hope that people take an opportunity to read the book, because to your point, and you said it perfectly, because I thought about this too, people didn't even bother to read the blurb. They saw the headline and the subheadline, and they made their conclusions, and their conclusions were incorrect. And I kept quiet. I made a really clear decision that I'm not gonna say anything. Our time will come. My time will come, like now, where I will speak for myself. And that's what I did. That's what I'm trying to do now. But you are correct. The reaction was very visceral, and it did not match what I was trying to say in the book. But at the same time, nobody read the book, right? So it was kind of this bizarre spiral that was happening. Now I have the opportunity. Now I'm out there. I appreciate talking to you on this, and I'll be having many other conversations, and hopefully we'll be given the opportunity to lay this out for people.
People may be listening to this conversation. They will read the book, and they will think about, with all that's happening in the country that feels insurmountable to some people, what do you say about either what private citizens should be doing or could be doing in this moment, or what the Democratic Party could be doing? What's the action that you want people to take away from reading your book?
So I would tell people right now in this moment, I understand that it's very scary. I understand that people are fearful, but that is the point. The point of the chaos, the point of Project 2025 is to put fear into people and silence you. And you cannot be silent right now, because in this moment, silence is complicit. You have to engage and stay engaged and ask the hard questions of yourself, of your community, and of your leadership. And this is the time to be more engaged and re-engage than ever before. And that's the first part of this. And I would say to the Democrat leadership and Democratic Party, this is the moment to be an opposition party. We cannot forget that the point of a party is to take action for the American people. You have to take action. It's not about politics. It's not about poll-tested lines. It's about doing the right thing. It's about being human. It's about making sure vulnerable communities are protected and not throwing anybody under the bus, any group under the bus. And that is incredibly important. And you have to show some fight. What does that look like? What does fighting in this moment look like? How do you show in messaging, but in action, that people see you? This cannot be as business as usual. It cannot. This is not the time. When they rubber stamped Donald Trump's nominees, I didn't understand why that even happened. We knew Project 2025 was very clear. They started off with anti-DEI. They started off with the federal government going after agencies. And then immigrants, migrants. I mean, they were very clear on what they were going to do. So they had the power. And so in this moment, they have power, even though they don't have the presidency, they don't have the House, and they don't have the Senate. They still have power. And what people are seeing is that they're giving up their power. They're behaving as if they're powerless. And that's the comments that I'm getting from people that I'm talking to. Many people feel this way. And I think there's ways for them to show action and not be a political party, but be a party that gives action and is opposing what we're seeing in this current moment.
My last question to you is a bit forward thinking. You were here in Connecticut about a month ago at the time that we're having this conversation for the Hartford Girls Rock event. And there's a video clip from you entering the room with the amazing young women that are being recognized. There is joy in that room. There is laughter in that room. There is possibility. And it is a beautiful moment to see these young women connect with you in that spirit of joy and possibility when so many things around them tell them that it's all doom and gloom and that they don't have a path forward. What helps you stay grounded and hopeful even as you navigate these challenging times?
Those 10 young women were incredibly impressive and very much about their community and their own future. And I have a little one myself, and watching her navigate through her life, her young life, and being part of that and helping her, that gives me confidence. And I will say, as you said, we were in joy in that moment. And a joy is a form of resistance. And I think that's something that Black people understand in this country, that joy is a form of resistance. And we cannot let them take our joy away. We cannot. Or our kids' future away. And we have to be really strategic and very focused on what is happening right now. Because if we're not, it's going to get a lot worse. And it's pretty bad right now. And joy is going to be key. Joy is a form of resistance. So we need to do that and continue to be as a community and lift each other up.
Karine Jean-Pierre was White House press secretary under former President Joe Biden. Her new book is Independent, a look inside a broken White House outside the party lines. Thank you, Karine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyan Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. Our interns are V. Zuong and Tale Ricketson. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.